Hi, I'm Duncan Kelbaugh, board member of the New Brunswick Horticultural Trades Association, coming to you from the green grass of my home here in East St. John. I'm presenting to you a video of the same name today about IPM, or Integrated Pest Management. That's a subject of great concern to the general public and members of the horticultural industry nowadays. So first, Neil Pond of Urban Landscaping will present the principles and practices of IPM in a commercial setting. Then I'll contrast that to how I take care of my own home turf here with no chemical inputs at all. You'll see that a lot of the strategies are the same. So now I'll turn it over to Neil and his lawn care story.
Hello, my name is Neil Pond, owner of Urban Landscaping Limited in Quispamsis, New Brunswick. And I'm talking to you here today representing the New Brunswick Horticultural Trades Association. And we're going to be talking about integrated pest management for lawn care in a residential setting, primarily for the lawn care industry. Some of the things that we're going to be covering today are going to differentiate between what conventional lawn care would be versus integrated pest management. Some of the things that we'll be talking about will cover practices that lawn care industries use today, but we'll be adding a few more details onto that. From a philosophical standpoint, IPM basically involves a little bit more of a customized approach to looking after a lawn on a case-by-case or a site-by-site basis, where conventional lawn care is more of a pre-planned, prescribed approach. What that does is that places more responsibility and more technical ability in the field for the lawn care practitioner or your IPM technician. And they are required to know a significant amount more in terms of plant health care and soil agronomics and that sort of thing. And that's what we'll be talking about today. The main components of an IPM program are monitor growing conditions, scouting for potential pest problems, identify potential pest threats or stress problems, determine action thresholds for intervention, determine treatment method, the most environmentally friendly, and follow up to ensure that actions taken are successful. Today we'll be talking about lawns in a residential setting, and typically those lawns would be fairly high-grade lawns, and we would like to classify those as a Class A residential. What that means is they would have about 50% Kentucky bluegrass with at most 10% weeds. And such lawns are important because they stay thick, and the significance of Kentucky bluegrass is that Kentucky bluegrass has underground roots called rhizomes, and these roots spread and they pop up new shoots. So Kentucky bluegrass is very important because of its ability to thicken up like a carpet and to help choke weeds, which is a key strategy in preventing weeds from establishing in a lawn and keeping your weed percentages low. Such grasses as Kentucky bluegrass have a dark color, and they also are a fairly wide blade as opposed to a fescue. Fescue is the other grass variety that we have in our region, and it's a finer blade such as you see here. Fescues are a rather tough plant. Therefore, they are a little easier to grow in a lawn setting, where Kentucky bluegrass has a bit more of a challenge to keep it healthy in a lawn. So when we look at a Class A lawn, we are going to tailor our practices around ensuring that the Kentucky bluegrass is the healthy grass that remains in the lawn. That is why the 50% rule is in there. And as you see here, you have a mix of fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. There are a few weeds, however, the percentages are relatively low. So the first topic to cover with IPM would be weed monitoring. Weeds are a major component of issues that we are faced with lawns. The way we would deal with weed monitoring with IPM would be what we call a quadrat method for weed counts. Basically what that is using your imagination, pacing off a 10 by 10 grid area of a lawn and counting the weeds in that area. Now how that is done is we usually just take 3 paces and then perpendicular to that area, take another 3 paces, and then you have your 10 by 10 grid. What we're trying to count are the more visible, obvious weeds in that area, those being the coarse weeds. Coarse weeds are the ones that the customers notice, the ones that have the most visual impact, thereby being the ones that are significant enough to count. If you have a large cluster of smaller weeds, such as a patch of clover, if you consider it to be a weed, or knotweed, or some other type, you may count that as 2 or 3 weeds. When you're doing your grids, you must do multiple grids on a property, and then you may want to average those out. But select probable stressed areas for doing your weed counts. These are the areas where you will reach a threshold sooner, enabling earlier treatment response, resulting in faster remediation time. Now, one of the issues with counting weeds is looking at what a visual count would be versus an actual scientific method. It's kind of like the weatherman. You have a feels like versus an actual in terms of temperature. The same is true for weeds. A 10% visual count is really more like 20% actual counting, because when you count every weed on a property in a 10 by 10 grid area, you're counting probably all the spreading, crawling weeds that are under the canopy of the turf, as well as the bigger coarse weeds, thereby increasing the actual real count. You have to get down on your hands and knees and check very closely. There are 2 types of lawn problems to look for. One would be pest problems, such as chinch bugs or weeds. The other would be environmental stress problems, typically caused by compaction, soil conditions, shade, low-lying areas, steep slopes, all of those kind of things. A key component to diagnosing lawn problems are looking for stress issues and looking at scouting for stress in the lawn. One of those components would be for weeds, obviously. Checking probable entry points is the best preventive approach for controlling weeds and getting an early jump on their spread. Such areas as the perimeter of the lawn, where they may enter from an adjacent property, along a field or a natural area, whether it be a wooded border or bushes, as well as along roadsides, driveways, ditches, and those areas where weeds are more adapted to and are able to penetrate the lawn. Stress conditions may coincide with chinch bug activity, which is another stress issue that is hard to detect and to differentiate. Chinch bugs prefer the same areas that you see the drought stress conditions showing in the lawn in the summer months, and therefore may be difficult to understand whether it is actually chinch bug or dryness. Soil conditions such as depth, soil depth, texture are key ingredients to look for in a soil to determine its health. Texture being the crumb structure, you should be able to see macropores and micropores and lots of air pockets in and around the soil. Without that, you have a lower oxygen soil and a lot more compaction probability from within the soil. A friable soil is a soil that you can actually squeeze in your hand and then very easily crumble it up into smaller pieces. And that is how you would look to see if you have that sort of crumb structure as well. Low wet shady areas are a major problem in lawns, especially in our region where we have a lot of rainfall annually. When you get into shade and low wet areas, the oxygen levels typically are low because moisture occupies those macropores where you would normally have available oxygen. And inevitably we see compaction, which equates to thin turf and often weed invasion from weeds which are opportunistic to that condition, such as moss and creeping bentgrass. In this case, these plants do not require a deep root and can grow on the surface, and this condition of low oxygen and moisture makes an ideal situation for them to thrive. Therefore, it's important that we monitor the soil condition and moisture to determine whether enough drainage is present in the lawn. If it's all even, it's nice and green on the top, but when you lay it down, you can see that it's just a tuft of stem with a very little bit of root and just a little bit of green on the top. And it's like a moss, you know, it grows where there's dampness or compaction, and it grows where the bluegrass is having problems growing. That's bluegrass right here. That's bentgrass, creeping bent. So you can see the difference. Sunny, dry, sloped areas, which are almost the opposite extreme, are often a very stressful condition for a lawn. Too dry equates to compaction, where the ground and the soil become hard, especially when you add traffic based on use on top of it. What happens in this situation is the turf can become thin, and you will see little or no bluegrass as a result of that because it is more sensitive to this condition. When this condition occurs, you can get weed invasion into the area and therefore have high weed counts, creating more problems with maintenance. Some of the indicators for stress that you can look for in a lawn situation is certain conditions that you will come across, such as a lawn that is all fescue with little or no bluegrass. When you see this condition, it typically indicates that there's probably poor or dry soil or little soil at all, and usually you'd have coarse gravel or compacted ground underneath. Another condition that can cause this is the fact that a low mowing height with a typical ride-on mower can cause added stress to bluegrass, causing it to die off or become thin, where the fescue is more tolerant of that. A weedy lawn typically could be a sign of acidic soils or poor soil fertility and even compaction. Indicator plants for compaction would be prostrate knotweed, which you typically see along the side of roads and ditches and pathways. Also, acidity. One of the things that can identify acidity are wild strawberry as well as hawkweed. These two weeds typically thrive in an area where acidity is rather high. Creeping bentgrass and moss are typically a sign of a tight soil with this low oxygen, moist condition. Thin lawns with bare spots, probably the number one symptom that we see, are usually a combination or caused by any one of the following: compaction, shade, tight soils, poor subsoil, little or no topsoil, and poor fertility. One of the considerations for looking at the soil and understanding what is going on is to have a soil test, and where you have an analysis, a laboratory analysis of the soil. And when we do this, usually it would be when there are problem lawns where you need to verify or confirm what you suspect you see on the lawn. On a new lawn, it's good to have a soil test performed to use as a benchmark where you have no history of how the lawn performs or responds to certain stresses. Soil testing is a valuable tool that you can use to share results with a customer to communicate what is happening and what your services are providing. It's important that you interpret and advise the customer of the results of a soil test, as it may be difficult for them to understand if you just gave it to them. A suggestion to include with the soil test would be to include the percentage of organic matter that is existing on the soil in that lawn. Another one is the cation exchange capacity, which is a good indication of fertility.
Before Neil moves on to the third stage of IPM, I'd like to contrast the IPM methods to the way I take care of my own home turf. Last summer, I taped an explanation of my own lawn care strategy, so let's take a look at that. Hi, I'm Duncan Kelbaugh. I own Brunswick Nurseries, a landscape and garden center business. Although we're in the green industry, we don't do lawn care. So that allows me today to speak to you personally as an experienced home gardener and talk to you about how I take care of my lawn and gardens without chemical inputs. Now that's one step further than IPM, in which chemical tools can be used as a last resort. In my case, my philosophy is to only use natural materials in caring for my lawn and gardens. You could call that organic gardening, but really it's just a philosophy where I don't have to worry about any risks to my well, my kids, pets in the yard, or wildlife, and not be concerned with any pollutants that might go in the runoff from my yard down to the river. Part of the strategy is psychological, convincing yourself that you don't need a perfect indoor-outdoor carpet of a lawn, 100% Kentucky bluegrass with no exceptions. I'm quite happy with the diverse community of plants that makes up my lawn. As long as it's healthy, smooth, and green, I'm happy. And the nice thing about that is a diverse makeup of plant species makes the lawn less attractive to pests, and you'll wind up with less significant outbreaks of insects and disease. In order to adapt to the bloom period of dandelions and hawkweed, I simply mow the lawn more often during their 2 to 3 weeks bloom period. I still want to have as healthy and gorgeous a looking lawn as I can with my natural inputs. So what's involved in that? Well, any discussion of lawn health has to start first with the soil. That's the basis for the health of all plants. I'm blessed on this property, as with any older home, with great natural soil. It's deep, loamy, and fertile, and in a natural soil profile, meaning that the subsoil is still connected to the topsoil above, and it acts as a moisture reserve. In drier times, water is wicked and carried from the subsoil up into the topsoil. Keeps it good and moist, and my lawn never turns brown in the summer, and I've never had chinch bug, which is an infestation often related to dryness. So what can you do? Well, if you happen to be in the fortunate position of developing a new lot, try to save all that original topsoil. Even if it's stumps or rocks in it, it's still going to be very good material to build lawn with. So after the construction, get that saved pile of topsoil spread back out, and as much as possible, don't interrupt it with sand or gravel fill. That layer of gravel acts as a block to that natural upflow of moisture that keeps the lawn moist and healthy during the drier parts of the summer. The only inputs to my lawn are single annual applications of granular organic fertilizer and lime. This, combined with leaving the grass clippings, seems to provide plenty of fertility to make my grass thick, healthy, and green. They say that leaving the grass clippings on can reduce the need for fertilizer by up to 50%. I don't have a mulching mower, which would be great for that, so what I do is go around the outside spraying the grass outwards first, and that distributes it evenly over the lawn. There are two other lawn care operations that I no longer do because I heard logical arguments why I wouldn't have to. The first is dethatching. Thatch is a buildup of grass stems and leaves at the soil surface, and it seems to be worst under chemical management, where the plenty of nitrogen stimulates a lot of top growth, and then the chemical input depletes or eliminates microbial breakdown of that grass and stem buildup, so thatch becomes quite an issue. Here it's not at all. The other thing I don't do anymore is aerate. In my highly organic porous soil, it's simply not necessary. If there was a lot of traffic here and I felt the soil was really compacted, then I would aerate, but I don't have to, so why bother? Try to keep things simple. I do believe in mowing at about 3 inches, maybe a little higher than some people. If you mow lower, you're cutting the leaves off the grass plants, and those stems take quite a while to grow the leaves back again. That leaves the soil vulnerable for weeds to get started because the sunlight can reach the surface. So it takes less work to mow higher, and it's better for the turf. I'm all for anything that makes life simpler for me, the gardener. For my Healthy Green Lawn in St. John, I'm Duncan Kelbaugh. And now I'll bring you up to speed on Neil's progress through the stages of IPM. He has monitored the lawn, identified potential pest problems, and now gets to the stage of considering whether to take action or not and what the appropriate actions might be. The minimal level at which you consider acting upon a pest issue is called the action threshold.
For simplicity's sake, for IPM as a practice on an ongoing basis, we would count one coarse weed as 1% to keep it simple. Therefore, if you had in a 10 by 10 area 5 weeds, coarse weeds that are visible, you would call that 5%. The action threshold for consumer response is typically starting at around 1%, and that would be when a homeowner would notice weeds. At 10% weed count, that is typically the uppermost limit to their tolerance. Therefore, the treatment threshold, which is when you would begin to treat for those weeds, would be between 1% and 5%. One of the methods of controlling weeds that is chemical-free would be hand weeding. Productivity with hand weeding varies based on the weed density, and that being how closely together the weeds are and how much walking you have to do between weeds. Hand weeding is effective at maintaining low weed counts once the weeds are initially under control, typically at or below 1%. Other methods of controlling weeds involve spraying them with herbicide. Spraying methods typically are spot spraying, which is a preferred method with IPM, and blanket spraying, which can also be used. The spot spray method involves using the same equipment as normal, except when you're pressing the spray trigger to deliver brief bursts, it's usually up to about 3 seconds, while passing the spray wand over the weed area that does not require step movement. Blanket spraying method is a little more lengthy, and it involves pressing and holding open the spray trigger for more than 3 seconds to deliver a constant stream of control material to a grid area that requires step movement. Blanket treatment does not necessarily mean that the entire lawn area has been treated, but that larger grid areas from within the property boundary were treated. Blanket treatment can still represent a small percentage of overall property area treated. Once you have determined some of the lawn problems or stress problems that are occurring on a property, certain recommendations need to be made to the client. Such recommendations may include, for compaction, for example, a core aeration followed with a top dressing of compost, which is a thin layer applied to the surface. When you see thin, little or no bluegrass, a core aeration, top dressing with compost along with overseeding may be the best thing to do to introduce bluegrass back into that lawn. Another a word of advice would be to communicate to the customer would be to raise the mowing height, because oftentimes it's the low mowing that causes the bluegrass to subside. When you have a lawn condition where you see 50% weeds or more, one of the recommendations may be to blanket spray that area at least once to knock the populations of weeds down, and follow up with a top dress overseed recommendation. The other recommendation may be to renovate the lawn and start it over, where the weed count is so high. It may be difficult to overcome this by just overseeding. Eliminating a lawn on steep slope areas is always a good suggestion, and often recommendations such as flower beds, ground cover, naturalizing with wild plants, applying some kind of decorative stone, or mulching these areas is often a good recommendation and can eliminate a lot of problems in terms of nuisance areas for lawns. When shade conditions are persistent, a good recommendation to the client would be to prune the tree to filter light through the canopy. This will enable enough light to filter down through so that you may be able to grow bluegrass as well as fescue in those areas. Elimination of lawn under the tree is also a good idea, where you can add flower beds or mulched areas. One of the things with IPM that needs to be considered is how you structure the services. It's important that there is good communication with the customer and that there is good, thorough record keeping so that the information does not get lost and can be used at a later date. So from a service structure standpoint, it is good to have certain things included in your program, such as follow-up visits for inspection. For example, when you have high weed counts, such as over 5% on a customer's lawn, you should have a system that automatically has you rescheduled to revisit that property within a 7 to 10 day period to inspect it and to possibly respray it again so that you can maintain an acceptable level of weeds. Seeding results is another important factor. When you have a seeding job, it's important that in about a 30-day time frame you come back and return to that property to see if the germination was successful or not. In such cases, you may want to provide a leaflet or a handout or a pass-fail letter which would indicate whether the operation was successful or not. If not, reseeding may be necessary and may need to be done immediately after, so timely delivery of this is very important. With chinch bug problems, where the damage could be quite severe, a revisit in 3 to 5 days might be needed. So organizing your services and scheduling is a logistics issue, but is very important to deliver good results, and with an integrated pest management service, it's even more important. Communication with the customer is a key thing in any service, and this is also true for integrated pest management. It's nice to ask them to check and call within a few days if they see problems with their lawn, and it's good to engage them and involve them in what is going on. Fertility programs that are associated with an IPM program do not have to be tied directly to the IPM activity, at least from a scheduling standpoint. Conventional lawn care, typically you may start weed control at a certain round when you start a certain fertilizer application. With an IPM program, you could start your weed sprays halfway through a round if necessary, and it is all based on weather conditions and agronomics. IPM is an on-demand type of service. You have to spray and treat and apply control measures when the conditions warrant. It is not based on a calendar where you spray based on the time of year, but more by what the individual lawn conditions are requiring. IPM should be a no-fee service for control applications, thereby not having an incentive to spray, but rather an incentive to save on costs and to reduce pesticide usage. Some of the key tools to communicate what you're seeing agronomically on a lawn would be an assessment. Typically it would be done in the summer where you have more stress conditions from drought to see what is going on, as well as you're in the middle of the season and it leaves you time to act on those results in the latter part of the season. An agronomic assessment is basically an update that you would give a customer on the lawn's condition. Also, you can make recommendations to the customer and advise on additional services that could be used to benefit the condition of the lawn. An IPM technician would leave a report after each visit. This IPM tech report basically would indicate what that individual has done during that visit and report to the customer the condition of the lawn in such ways as the monitoring information, where weed percentage counts and insect checks and insect counts could be left with the customer. It is reassuring as a customer to know that an IPM technician is actually taking the time to look at the lawn and to do the necessary steps to ensure that their lawn is being looked after properly. Customer leave-behinds are an important educational tool that should be used with an IPM program, and these are important to educate the customer about IPM techniques and services and how they are delivered. A service agreement is something that is strongly recommended where an IPM type of service may differ from what a customer is used to in a conventional lawn care situation. It should help explain how your IPM services operate and address any liability or warranty issues that you may have to have out in the open with your customer prior to providing the services. In an IPM system, you should be promoting continuous service from year to year as you're building on what you have done from the previous year. Where a lawn is a dynamic living ecosystem, you will need to build on what you've done the previous year to enhance it the following year. Provide organic and organic-based fertility programs is also a good recommendation if you want to build a healthy soil as part of your plant health care recommendations and practices. That concludes this session of how to implement IPM lawn care practices.
As you can see, there are very many ways to cope with the potential insect, disease, and weed problems other than the traditional chemical, fertilizer, and pesticide applications. The common ground between IPM and the chemical-free method I use in my home turf is the provision of healthy growing conditions for grass. IPM needn't be feared by the lawn care industry as closing doors. In fact, it opens many potential opportunities for lawn service providers. From the green grass of my home, I encourage you to think green.
This is awful. This is like the outtakes, you know, of a TV show. Scotty's having a great time.
The other thing I stopped doing is, I forget.
Brought to you by the New Brunswick Horticultural Trades Association. That's no good, is it? All right. Okay. Now I'm smiling too. This is hard. Okay, so.
As you can see, there are very many ways. My lips are freezing here. As you can see, there are very many ways to cope with potential weed, insect, and disease applications. As you can see, there are very many ways to cope with potential insect disease.
Take 3. A little lower.